The doors of the emergency bay burst open, and the gurney came through fast, wheels screaming against tile, two paramedics shouting numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside that room. The man on the gurney had a wound under his collarbone, and a face the color of old paper. His name, scrawled on the chart someone slapped onto the counter, was Daniel Reyes. He was 34 years old. He was barely breathing. Maren Cole was already moving before the doors finished swinging shut behind him. She did not run. She never ran. Running wasted the kind of energy a person needed for the next 10 minutes, and the next 10 minutes were the only ones that mattered. She crossed the room in long, even steps, snapped on gloves without glancing down at her hands, and took her place at the head of the bed like she had been standing there her whole life. "Pressure's dropping," someone called. "I know," Maren said. Her voice did not rise. It never rose. That alone made her unusual on a floor, where everyone else's voice climbed half an octave during a code. But on a night like this, nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. For the next 40 minutes, the room moved around Daniel Reyes like weather. Doctors came and went. A resident nearly knocked over a tray, and Maren caught it without seeming to look at it. When his heart rate dipped into territory that made the monitor scream, she was already reaching for the crash cart before the sound finished its first cycle. By the time the surgeon arrived to take him up to the operating room, Daniel Reyes was alive, stable, and entirely unaware that the woman who kept him that way had once done far more dangerous work than this. Nobody at Eastbridge Regional knew what Maren Cole used to be. That was the way she wanted it. She had worked nights on this floor for 3 years. Before that, her file said very little, and what little it said was carefully unremarkable. A few years in the service, an honorable discharge, a gap nobody in human resources had ever bothered to question, because the rest of the file read so cleanly that interviewers tended to stop reading closely the moment they reached the part where she had a steady hand and a calm voice. What the file did not say was 6 years in the Navy, 2 of them spent on work that never made it into any folder anyone outside a very small circle was permitted to open. It did not say that Maren Cole could place a shot through a target from 800 yards in wind that would have flattened a lesser shooter, and that she had done exactly that, more times than she let herself remember. She had walked away from that life on purpose. She had wanted quiet. She had wanted a job where the worst emergencies were medical ones, where the only thing she aimed for was a vein, where no one was waiting on the far side of a long lens for her to make a mistake. She did not know, standing over Daniel Reyes that night, that the quiet was about to end. Reyes came out of surgery a little after 3 in the morning and was moved to the intensive care unit, into a room with a narrow window overlooking the parking lot. Maren was assigned as his primary nurse for the remainder of her shift. Nobody explained why 2 federal agents were posted outside his door instead of the single hospital guard who usually covered the floor. Nobody had to. She had spent enough years around careful, watchful men to recognize exactly what they were guarding against. She pieced the truth together the way nurses always piece things together, in fragments, through hallway conversation and phone calls overheard a little too clearly. Daniel Reyes was not simply a man who had been shot. He was the only living witness in a federal case against a trafficking operation that moved through 3 states and answered, ultimately, to a man named Victor Lang, a name the agents outside the door were visibly careful not to say too loudly, in a building with thin walls. Reyes was scheduled to testify in 9 days. Someone had tried to make certain that testimony never happened, and they had come close enough to succeeding that the attempt still showed in the gray of his face. Maren absorbed all of this quietly, the way she absorbed a blood pressure reading. She filed it away and went back to checking his vitals every 15 minutes, the same as she would for anyone. Around 4 in the morning, Reyes surfaced briefly from the fog of anesthesia, his eyes opening halfway, finding her face in the dim light of the room and holding there. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at the first solid thing they find after nearly losing everything, as if checking that the room, and his own place in it, were both still real. "Am I going to make it?" he said finally, his voice cracked and thin. "You already did," Maren told him. "The hard part's behind you now." He studied her for a moment longer, then let his eyes drift shut again, some of the tension easing out of his jaw. It was a small exchange, the kind she had with frightened patients a dozen times a week, and yet something about the way he had asked the question, the particular fear underneath it, stayed with her longer than it should have. Most patients were afraid of dying. Reyes seemed afraid of something more specific than that, something with a name and a face, and Marin found herself wondering, not for the first time that night, exactly how much danger had followed him through those emergency doors. One of the agents outside the door, a younger man who introduced himself only as Dale, stepped in around 5 to check on his charge and found Marin adjusting an IV line with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. He lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching her work. "You're good at this," he said, an odd note of appraisal in his voice, the kind people use when they are sizing someone up without quite meaning to. "It's the job," Marin said, not looking up. "Most nurses I've worked protective details with get rattled, having agents standing in the hallway all night. You haven't asked a single question about why we're here. I figured you'd tell me if it was something I needed to know." She finished securing the line and finally met his eyes. "Is it?" Dale considered that for a moment, then offered the same careful half-answer she suspected he gave everyone who asked. "Just routine precaution," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Marin did not believe him. Not entirely, but she let it go, because pressing would only have made her more memorable than she wanted to be on a floor where memorable was the last thing she could afford to become. She finished her rounds, checked Reyes one final time before her shift ended, and noted, with the part of her mind that never fully rested, that the agent's hand had drifted to his hip more than once during their short conversation, the reflex of a man who had been told, somewhere along the line, to expect trouble before it arrived. But something inside her had shifted, the way it used to shift before an assignment, a small internal switch flipping somewhere she had not used in 3 years. She found herself noting the exits in the room without meaning to. She found herself counting how many staff badges passed the nurses' station in a given hour, the way she once counted footsteps in corridors that were never hers to begin with. She told herself it was nothing, old habits, the kind that never entirely leave, no matter how many quiet years a person stacks on top of them. At 6 that morning, when her shift ended, she stopped at the lounge window with a cup of coffee and looked down at the lot the way she always did before heading home. A black SUV sat parked across the street, not in the hospital lot, not near the entrance, but positioned with a clean line of sight to both the ambulance bay and the main doors. 2 men sat inside it. Neither moved to get out. Neither appeared to be doing anything at all except sitting very still and watching the building. Marin had spent years learning the difference between a man waiting for a ride and a man conducting surveillance. The 2 in that SUV were not waiting for a ride. She did not alert hospital security. She did not say anything to the agents stationed outside Reyes's door, not yet, because she had learned long ago that a single observation without proof was worth less than careful patience. Instead, she finished her coffee, watched the vehicle for exactly 4 more minutes, memorized the plate, the make, the slight dent above the rear wheel well, and walked out to her car the way any tired nurse walks out after a long night. She did not go home, not directly. She circled the block once, slow, the way a person drives when they are not lost, only looking. By the time she came back around, the SUV was gone. No trace remained that it had ever been parked there at all, except in the part of her mind that had never fully learned how to switch off, the part that had kept her alive through things she did not talk about with anyone, not even herself, most days. She drove home as the sun came up over the rooftops, let herself into a small, quiet apartment that held almost nothing personal, and stood for a long moment in front of the window before she finally drew the blinds. She told herself the SUV could have been nothing. A delivery driver early for a shift. A man waiting on a phone call he did not want overheard. She had told herself stories like that before, in places far more dangerous than this one, and she had learned that the stories rarely held up against the part of her that noticed first and explained later. She tried to sleep and managed only a few restless hours, her mind circling back again and again to the man on the gurney, to the agents outside his door, to the 9 days standing between Daniel Reyes and a courtroom he might never reach. Somewhere across the city, in an office with the blinds drawn against the daylight, a man named Victor Lang was already making a phone call about a hospital room on the 4th floor of Eastbridge Regional, about a witness who was supposed to be dead and instead was very much alive, and about how soon that particular mistake could be corrected. He had no idea that the nurse charting his target's vitals every 15 minutes had once done work that made his own line of business look careless by comparison. He was about to find out, though not nearly as soon as he expected to. 3 days passed, and Eastbridge Regional settled into a strange new rhythm. Daniel Reyes improved steadily, color returning to his face, strength returning to his voice, though his eyes carried the particular flatness of a man who knew exactly how close he had come to never waking up at all. The two federal agents outside his door rotated in shifts, polite and watchful, drinking too much vending machine coffee and trying not to look as tense as they clearly were. A federal prosecutor named Iris Doyle visited twice, briefcase in hand, speaking to Reyes in a low voice behind a closed door, for exactly as long as the doctors allowed. Marin kept working her shifts like nothing had changed. She checked vitals, she adjusted medication, she made small talk with Reyes about nothing in particular, the kind of talk that puts a frightened patient at ease, without asking him to relive whatever it was that frightened him. She never mentioned the SUV from her first night on his case. She never mentioned what she used to be. Not to him, not to anyone. But underneath the easy rhythm of her shifts, she was watching, in the patient, unhurried way of someone who had spent years learning that the people worth worrying about rarely announced themselves loudly. She watched the badge scanner logs when nobody else was looking, noting which staff identification accessed the 4th floor after midnight, cross-referencing names against the schedule posted in the break room. She watched the new faces on the rotation, because a hospital this size cycled through enough staff that 1 or 2 unfamiliar people a week was perfectly normal, and that normalcy was exactly the kind of cover a careful person would choose to hide inside. She watched, and on the second night after Reyes woke fully from surgery, she found something that made the old stillness in her chest settle into something sharper. A man in hospital scrubs pushed a supply cart down the 4th floor hallway just after 1 in the morning. Nothing about him should have drawn a second look. He had a badge clipped to his chest, a name printed on it that matched no one Marin had ever worked alongside, and a face arranged into the kind of bland, forgettable pleasantness that hospital staff often wore at that hour, exhaustion smoothing every other expression into something interchangeable. He smiled at the agent outside Reyes's door, said something about restocking supplies in the room next door, and kept moving without breaking stride. Marin noticed 3 things in the 4 seconds it took him to pass her station. His badge photo did not quite match his face, the angle of the jaw slightly off in the way a borrowed or altered badge sometimes was, a small detail most people would never have caught, and one she had been trained to catch without thinking about it. He pushed the supply cart like it weighed more than the carts on that floor usually weighed. The muscles of his forearm tensed in a way that suggested he was bracing against the handle, rather than simply pushing it along. And as he passed an empty patient room, his eyes flicked inside for exactly half a second longer than a man genuinely checking for supplies would ever need. She said nothing. She finished charting a routine note, walked it down to the nurse's station with the easy, unhurried pace of someone with nowhere urgent to be, and from there, watched the man continue past the supply closet he had claimed to be heading toward, all the way to the end of the hallway, where he stopped at a door marked for restricted access, and ran a badge across the scanner mounted beside it. The light blinked green. Marin felt something cold settle into her chest. Not panic, nothing so loud as panic, just a flat, clear certainty, the same certainty she used to feel right before a shot she already knew she would not miss. Whoever this man was, he had access he should not have had, and he had used it without any hesitation at all, which meant the badge in his hand was either stolen outright or built carefully enough to fool a scanner that should have caught the difference between a real credential and a forged one. She did not confront him. She did not alert the agents posted outside Reyes's door. Instead, she walked, calm and unhurried, back to the nurse's station, picked up the internal phone, and quietly requested that Daniel Reyes be moved to a different room on the floor, citing a minor issue with the ventilation in his current one, an excuse so small and so boring that no one questioned it for even a moment. Within the hour, Reyes was resting 2 doors down and around a corner, in a room with a clear line of sight from the nurse's station, and the agents outside his door had no idea their patient had moved for any reason beyond standard hospital routine. Marin went home that morning and did not sleep, not properly. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every detail of the man's face, the cart, the badge, the half-second too long his eyes had lingered on an empty doorway. She had spent 3 years building a life where she did not have to think this way anymore, where the most dangerous thing in her day was a patient coding on a table, and now here it was again. That old internal stillness, that flat readiness she had never quite managed to put down, no matter how far she had run from it. She thought, briefly, about calling someone, an old contact, A name from a life she had told herself she had closed the door on for good. A voice she had not heard in 3 years, belonging to a man who had once been her commanding officer. A man named Hale, who had taught her more about patience than anyone else she had ever known. She did not pick up the phone, not yet. She told herself she needed more before she pulled anyone else into this. More than a strange badge and a man who lingered too long at an empty doorway. She told herself that, and some small, honest part of her knew it was not entirely the reason. The truth was simpler and harder to look at directly. She did not want to open that door again. She did not want to remember how good it had once felt to be the most dangerous person in any room she walked into. She went back to work that evening anyway, because Daniel Reyes did not have the luxury of her hesitation, and somewhere out there, a man who had survived worse things than a hospital corridor was already deciding it was time to stop being careful. The next 2 nights passed without incident, which only deepened the unease sitting low in Marin's chest. She checked the restricted door at the end of the hallway each time she passed it, found it locked, found nothing out of place, and told herself that perhaps the man with the mismatched badge had simply moved on, frightened off by a moved patient and a locked door he could no longer talk his way past. She did not believe it, not really. People who went to the trouble of forging hospital credentials did not give up because a single room assignment changed. She spent her off hours doing the kind of quiet investigation she had once done for a living. Though the targets were smaller now, the stakes more personal. She drove past the address listed on the man's forged badge and found, as she expected, that it belonged to an empty lot 2 streets over from a shuttered laundromat. She ran the plate of the SUV she had memorized her first morning on the case through a contact she still trusted, an old friend from her service years who now worked a desk job that gave him access to databases most civilians never saw, and learned that the vehicle had been reported stolen 11 days earlier from a parking structure across town. None of it surprised her. All of it confirmed what she had already known the moment she watched that badge scanner blink green. On the 3rd night, she arrived for her shift early, an hour before she was scheduled to clock in, and used the time to walk the floor slowly, memorizing every camera angle, every blind spot, every door that locked automatically, and every one that did not. She had done this kind of preparation before, in places far more dangerous than a hospital corridor, and the familiarity of it settled something in her, even as it unsettled her in other ways, reminding her how easily the old patterns came back once she let them. Daniel Reyes noticed the change in her almost immediately when she came in to check his vitals. "You seem different tonight," he said, watching her with the particular sharpness of a man who had spent the last week learning to read every face that entered his room for signs of danger. "Different how?" Marin asked, keeping her voice light as she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "I don't know. Quieter, more careful." He paused, studying her a moment longer. "Is something wrong?" Marin considered her answer carefully, weighing how much truth a frightened man recovering from a near-fatal wound could reasonably carry, without that truth becoming its own kind of injury. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said finally, echoing, without meaning to, the same careful half-answer the federal agent had once given her. "I just want to make sure you stay safe until your court date." Reyes held her gaze a moment longer, and something in his expression suggested he understood she was not telling him everything, but he let it go, the way a person learns to let things go when they have already survived one attempt on their life and cannot bear to imagine surviving a second. Marin finished her rounds and returned to the nurse's station, where she spent the quiet hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, doing what she did best, watching without appearing to watch, cataloging every small detail that crossed her line of sight. At 2:40, a maintenance worker she did not recognize passed through the floor, badge clipped properly, movements entirely ordinary, and she let her guard ease, just slightly, before catching herself and reminding herself that ordinary was exactly the costume a careful person would choose to wear. At 3:15, the restricted door at the end of the hallway opened from the inside. Marin watched from the nurse's station as a man stepped out, not the same one from 2 nights earlier, but similar in the careful blankness of his expression, the kind of face built to be forgotten the moment it left a room. He wore street clothes beneath an unbuttoned hospital coat, an outfit designed to pass a glance without surviving any real scrutiny. He paused in the hallway, looked toward Reyes's old room, found it empty, and his expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that looked almost like irritation. He had not known about the room change. That told Marin something important. Whatever surveillance this organization had managed to establish inside the hospital, it was not complete, not yet, which meant there was still time to stay ahead of it. She did not move from the nurse's station. She watched him check his phone, type a short message, then slip back through the restricted door before anyone else on the floor noticed he had ever been there at all. The whole exchange lasted under 90 seconds. Marin sat very still after he disappeared, her pulse steady, her hands resting flat on the counter in front of her, and allowed herself, for the first time since this had all begun, to fully acknowledge what she already knew. This was not a single attempt that had failed and ended. This was a sustained operation, patient and well-resourced, run by people who had access to forged credentials, stolen vehicles, and apparently some manner of inside information about a federal protective detail that should have been far harder to penetrate than it evidently was. She thought about Detective Ingram's card, sitting in the drawer of her kitchen counter at home, given to her after a minor incident the previous year that had nothing to do with any of this. She thought about the agents stationed outside Reyes's door, exhausted and underprepared for an enemy this organized. She thought, finally, about the version of herself that existed before Eastbridge Regional, before the quiet life she had built, shift by shift, the version who would have already moved, already acted, already ended this, before it had the chance to escalate any further. She did not make a decision that night. She told herself she needed one more piece of information before she acted, one more confirmation that what she suspected was true, and she went home as the sun rose with that justification sitting uneasily in her chest, aware even as she told herself the story that she was, in some quiet way, stalling. She did not have to wait long for her answer. The following evening, she arrived for her shift to find the floor unusually tense, agents speaking in low-clipped tones near the nurse's station, Iris Doyle's car still parked outside an hour past her usual departure time. Detective Ingram stood near the elevator bank, arms crossed, speaking quietly with Linda Park, the hospital administrator, both of their faces drawn with the particular strain of people who had just learned something they did not want to be true. Grace Whitfield, the nurse Marin had worked alongside for 2 years, caught her near the locker room before she had even clocked in, her voice low and urgent. "They found a second badge," Grace said. "Same setup as before. Forged credential, restricted access, the whole thing. Security pulled the footage and there's a man on it who matches a description IT got off a database search this afternoon. They think he's connected to whoever sent the first one." Marin absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, quietly, without visible reaction, though something in her chest had already gone very still, the particular stillness she recognized now as the moment before action replaced patience entirely. "Do they have a name?" she asked. Grace shook her head. "Not yet. But Ingram thinks whoever's running this isn't going to stop at sending people in disguised as staff. He thinks they're getting impatient. He thinks something's going to happen soon." Marin nodded slowly, already calculating, already running through every exit and blind spot she had memorized over the past 2 nights, already feeling the old switch in her mind settle fully into place, the one she had spent 3 years trying to convince herself she no longer needed. Marin spent the rest of that shift moving through her usual duties with the same steady competence she always carried, checking vitals, adjusting medications, reassuring patients who had no idea anything unusual was happening on their floor at all. But beneath the surface, she was already preparing, the way she used to prepare before an operation, running through contingencies, identifying choke points, deciding which corridors offered cover and which left a person exposed. She found herself, during a quiet stretch near midnight, standing at the supply room door longer than the task in front of her required, studying the layout with a fresh and deliberate eye. 2 exits, a narrow space between the shelving units that could become either a trap or an advantage depending on who controlled it first. A heavy metal cart that, in the right hands, was no longer simply a cart. She filed each detail away without quite admitting to herself why she was doing it, though the part of her that had once made a living out of exactly this kind of attention already knew. Before she left for the night, she stopped by Reyes's new room one last time. He was awake, reading something on a tablet one of the agents had brought him, and he looked up when she entered, searching her face the way he always did now, looking for whatever small sign might tell him how worried he actually needed to be. "Get some rest," Marin told him. "You're going to need it." "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question. A man who had learned, in the space of a single terrifying week, exactly how much safety could depend on one steady presence in a room full of strangers. "I'll be here," she said, and meant it more fully than he could have understood. She drove home as a thin gray light began to spread over the rooftops, and for the first time since this had all begun, she did not try to convince herself that the danger might simply pass on its own. Somewhere across the city, in a building far from Eastbridge Regional's quiet hallways, a man named Connor Voss was receiving instructions of his own, instructions that would bring him back through those same doors within 24 hours, this time with no badge at all, and no patience left for forged credentials or careful disguises. He had decided, in the way men like him decided things, that the easiest path forward ran directly through whichever nurse kept moving his target out of reach. The next night began like all the others, soft beeping monitors, dim corridor lights, the particular hush of a hospital after visiting hours, when the only sounds left belonged to machines and tired feet. Marin clocked in at 7 and reviewed her patient list, finding Daniel Reyes's chart sitting exactly where it always sat. He managed a small, tired smile when she came in to check on him, a little less haunted than it had been a week earlier, and asked her, the way he always did now, whether anything interesting had happened on the floor. "Same as always," she told him, which was not quite a lie, and not quite the whole truth either. By midnight, the floor had gone fully still, the kind of stillness that made every small sound travel farther than it should. Marin made her rounds, checked the restricted door at the end of the hallway, found it locked and undisturbed, and let herself believe, for a few quiet minutes, that perhaps tonight would pass without incident. She did not fully believe it, but she let the thought sit there anyway, because the alternative kept her too sharp, too alert, for a job that demanded steady hands more than a racing mind. She stopped by Reyes's room once more before her late rounds, found him asleep, with the tablet still resting on his chest, his breathing even for the first time in days. She switched off the small reading light beside his bed and stood there a moment longer than the task required, thinking about the promise she had made him the night before, about being there, about the particular weight a promise like that carried, when the person making it understood exactly how much could go wrong before morning. She told herself the floor was quiet. She told herself the restricted door was locked. She told herself a great many reasonable things on her way back down the hallway, and none of them stopped the small cold thread of unease that had settled into her chest the moment Grace told her about the second forged badge. She was restocking gauze in the supply room just after 1 in the morning when she heard the door close behind her. It was not a loud sound. It was, in fact, a very quiet sound, the kind of careful click a door makes when someone wants it shut without announcing the fact. Marin did not turn around immediately. She finished placing the roll of gauze on the shelf in front of her, because the half-second it bought her was worth more than the half-second of looking, and in the small reflective surface of a metal cabinet across the room, she caught the shape of him. The man from 2 nights earlier, the one who had pushed a cart down the hallway pretending to restock bandages, only this time without scrubs, without a badge, without any of the bland, forgettable pleasantness he had worn before. He wore dark clothes that did not belong in a hospital at all, and he stood with the easy, unhurried posture of a man who believed the next few minutes already belonged to him. "You moved him," he said. His voice was low, almost friendly, the voice of a man who had said worse things to worse people, without losing a moment of sleep over any of it. "Took longer than I expected to find out which room. That was clever of you. Clever for a nurse." Marin turned around slowly. She kept her hands visible, loose at her sides, her weight settled evenly between both feet, in a way that looked, to him, like nothing at all. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He smiled at that, and the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Sure you don't." He took a step closer, unhurried, clearly enjoying himself, the way a man enjoys himself when he believes the only thing standing between him and an easy night is a woman in pale blue scrubs holding a box of bandages. "Here's how this goes. You're going to tell me which room he's in, and then you're going to forget you ever saw me. And maybe, if you're smart about it, you walk out of this hospital tonight exactly the way you walked in. And if I don't tell you," Marin said, "then we have a longer conversation than either of us wants to have." He said it lightly, almost cheerfully, the way some men said cruel things when they had stopped noticing the cruelty in them a long time ago. "I'd rather not. Genuinely. You seem like you're good at your job. I don't enjoy this part. You seem to be enjoying it a little." Something flickered across his face, brief and almost startled. the look of a man who had not expected the smaller person in the room to push back at all, let alone with that particular dry edge. He recovered a beat later, the smile sliding back into place, though it sat a little less easily now. "Funny," he said. "Most people in your position aren't funny. Most people in my position haven't met you before," Marin said. "I have the advantage of low expectations." He laughed at that, a real laugh this time, low and genuine, the laugh of a man who could not quite decide whether he was annoyed or amused, and had settled, for the moment, on amused. He shook his head slowly, looking her over the way a man looks over something he has already decided is no real threat. Soft hands, a clipboard set down somewhere behind her, scrubs entirely too practical to belong to anyone dangerous. "I have to admit," he said, leaning back against the shelving unit behind him, settling in like a man with all the time in the world, "you're more interesting than the last one of these I had to do. Most people in your position get quiet fast, or they cry. You'd be surprised how often they cry." "I imagine it's part of the job satisfaction for you," Marin said. "It's not my favorite part," he said, it almost thoughtfully, as if she had asked a sincere question and deserved a sincere answer. "My favorite part is when it's over and everyone involved finally stops talking. People talk too much right up until the end. You're talking a lot for someone who claims not to be scared." "I talk when I'm thinking," Marin said. "It helps me figure out what kind of mistake I'm dealing with." That landed somewhere it was not meant to land. She watched it happen, the small involuntary tightening around his eyes, a man unused to being assessed rather than feared. He pushed off the shelving unit and took another step toward her, the friendliness in his posture thinning into something more deliberate. "I figured a hospital like this would have better security than a scared little nurse standing in a supply closet," he said, the words coming out a touch harder than before. "I'm not scared," Marin said. Something in the way she said it made him pause, just barely, the smallest flicker of a man recalculating something he had not expected to need recalculating. It lasted less than a second. He shook it off easily, because men like him had learned, over years of doing exactly this kind of work, to trust their first read of a room, and rarely needed to trust a second one. "You should be," he said, and the friendliness in his voice thinned out the rest of the way, the first real crack in a performance he had clearly given many times before. "Do you know who sent me here?" "I don't need to," Marin said. "It doesn't change what happens next." "It might." He took another step closer, close enough now that the supply room had stopped feeling like a room with two exits, and started feeling like a room with exactly one. "The man I work for doesn't like loose ends. He especially doesn't like nurses who get cute moving patients around behind federal protection that's supposed to be airtight. You've already made this personal. I'd think hard about whether you want to make it worse for yourself before this conversation is finished. You're the one standing in a supply closet at 1 a.m, explaining your employment situation to a nurse," Marin said. "I'd say that's already worse for you than it is for me." His jaw tightened. The amusement in his face had nearly burned itself out now, replaced by something flatter, more businesslike, the look of a man returning to the actual purpose of the conversation, rather than enjoying the detour it had taken. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand drifting toward the inside of his jacket in a movement so practiced it barely registered as a movement at all, the kind of small adjustment a man made 100 times before he ever had to act on it. Marin saw it anyway. She had spent years learning to see exactly that kind of adjustment before the person making it fully understood they had made it. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice dropping lower, losing the last of its borrowed warmth. "You're going to walk me to whatever room they moved him to, quiet and easy, and then this stops being your problem at all. Or you keep talking, and we find out together how much of that calm is really yours, and how much of it is just very good acting." "It's not acting," Marin said. "Then prove it. Walk." "No," Marin said, and something in the single flat word landed differently than anything she had said before it. Simple, unhurried, entirely without performance. "I don't think I will." He studied her for a long second, something uncertain crossing behind his eyes, for the first time since the door had clicked shut behind him. He had walked into that room expecting fear, expecting a frightened woman to fold the moment he raised his voice, or stepped close enough to make his size felt. He had gotten none of that, and the absence of it sat wrong in his chest, in a way he could not name, and did not have time to examine. "Last chance," he said. "Which room?" He took one more step, closing the last of the distance between them, close enough now that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, The kind a person picked up, doing exactly this kind of work, for exactly this kind of employer. His hand finally came free of his jacket, and what it held caught the flat fluorescent light of the supply room for half a second before he let it rest, low and almost casual, against his thigh, as if its presence alone should have been enough to end the conversation. It was not enough. Marin did not so much as glance at it. Somewhere behind her eyes, far away from that supply room, a memory surfaced and vanished before it could fully form. A desert wind, a long quiet wait, a voice over a radio telling her to hold her breath and let the world go still. She had learned in those years that the people who survived were rarely the ones who reacted to threats. They were the ones who had already decided, long before the threat arrived, exactly what they would do when it did. She had already decided. Marin felt the old stillness settle fully into her chest, the same flat, clear quiet she used to feel in the seconds before a difficult shot, the kind of calm that other people mistook for fear because they had never once needed to learn the difference. She thought, briefly and without any drama at all, about Daniel Reyes 2 doors down and around a corner, about a courtroom waiting at the end of a week she intended to see him reach, about every quiet year she had spent trying to convince herself this part of her life was gone for good. It was not gone. It had simply been waiting. "You're making a mistake," she told him, her voice as even as it had been all night. "Not the one you think. Is that supposed to scare me?" "No," Marin said. "It's supposed to be fair warning. I don't think you've earned that from most people, so I figured I'd offer it anyway." "You talk a lot for someone with nothing in her hands," he said, and there was an edge to it now, the patience finally running out of him, the way it always eventually ran out of men who mistook stillness for surrender. "I don't need your warning. I need a room number." "You're not going to get one," Marin said, "and you're not going to hurt him. Not tonight. Not while I'm standing here." He laughed again, shorter this time, harder, less a laugh than a sound a man made to convince himself he was still in control of a situation that had quietly stopped belonging to him several exchanges earlier. "You think you can stop me? A nurse, in a closet, with a box of bandages. I think you should look a little closer at who you decided to corner tonight," Marin said. "I looked," he said. "I read the file before I ever set foot in this building. 3 years on this floor. No record of anything interesting before that. Just another tired nurse who pulls too many night shifts and goes home alone." "Files only tell you what someone decided to put in them," Marin said. "Yours left a few things out. Such as—" "You'll find out in a minute," she said, "and you're not going to like the timing." He studied her for a beat longer, some small uncertainty finally working its way past the confidence he had walked in wearing, though he covered it, the way men like him always did, with a short humorless smile and a slow shake of the head, as if her words were simply one more thing to be dismissed before he got back to the business at hand. He stared at her for a long second, something uncertain crossing behind his eyes, the first real hesitation he had shown since the door clicked shut behind him. He had walked into that room expecting fear, expecting a frightened woman to fold the moment he raised his voice, or stepped close enough to make his size felt. He had gotten none of that, and the absence of it sat wrong in his chest in a way he could not name and did not have time to examine, because Marin was already speaking again, quiet and precise. "You laughed at me a minute ago," she said. "You should have done your research first." "Research," he repeated, the word coming out flat, almost mocking, though there was less confidence in it now than there had been a minute earlier. "On a nurse." "On the wrong nurse," Marin said. He opened his mouth to answer her, some retort already forming, the kind of line a man like him kept ready for exactly this sort of moment, a final word meant to put the frightened little nurse back in her place before he got down to the business he had actually come to finish. He never got the chance to say it. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, though to the man standing in front of her it would feel, afterward, like considerably longer than that. He reached for her first, the way he always had, the way that had worked on every other person who had ever stood between him and a job he intended to finish. His hand closed on empty air, because Marin was no longer where she had been a half-second earlier. She had moved low and sideways, the kind of movement that looked, in the small space of a supply closet, less like a fight, and more like the room itself had simply rearranged its own geometry without warning. The first thing he understood was the cart. She drove it hard into the side of his knee, with enough force to fold his leg in a direction it had no interest in folding. The second thing he understood was the shelf behind him, his shoulder meeting it at a speed that turned a wall of careful inventory into a scattering avalanche of gauze and tubing and small plastic trays, the noise of it loud and sudden in a room built for silence. He never fully understood the third thing, only that it ended with him on the floor, his arm bent at an angle that made resistance an extremely bad idea, and a knee planted firmly between his shoulder blades. "Don't," Marin said quietly, in the same flat voice she used for telling a frightened patient to hold still during a needle stick. "I will not ask twice." He did not move again. He could not have, even if he had wanted to, because every part of him that might have tried had already learned, in the space of 90 seconds, exactly what kind of mistake he had made, walking into that room, expecting an easy night. She kept him pinned with the kind of patient, unhurried pressure that cost her almost nothing to maintain, and would have cost him a great deal to fight against, and reached with her free hand for the object he had dropped somewhere near the doorway during the brief, violent confusion of the last minute, sliding it well out of his reach with the flat side of her shoe before he had any chance to recover enough to lunge for it. The supply room door opened a few seconds later, and the agent who had been posted outside Reyes's old room, drawn by the crash of falling shelves, found Marin kneeling calmly over a restrained man twice her size, her scrubs barely wrinkled, her breathing entirely even, as though she had simply paused mid-shift to deal with a minor inconvenience. He stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, weapon half raised, trying to make sense of a scene that did not match anything his training had prepared him to expect. "Call security," Marin told him, "and call your supervisor. Tell them the man who's been watching Daniel Reyes's room just stopped being a problem." The agent did exactly that, though it took him 3 tries to get the words out steadily, because nothing in his career had prepared him for a hospital nurse who handled an armed intruder with the same unbothered competence she brought to a difficult intravenous line. Within 20 minutes, the hallway outside the supply room was full of security staff, 2 additional federal agents who had arrived at a dead run from the parking structure, and a hospital administrator named Linda Park, called in from home and still wearing her coat, demanding to know exactly what had happened on her floor in the space of 1 quiet hour. The man on the floor, restrained now with proper handcuffs rather than a nurse's knee, sat against the wall, while a paramedic checked his shoulder with brisk professional indifference. His eyes followed Marin everywhere she moved, an expression on his face that had nothing left of the easy confidence he had walked in with an hour earlier. He stared at her like a man trying to rerun the last 90 seconds in his head and make them add up to something that made sense. They did not. Nothing about a quiet hospital nurse in pale blue scrubs should have ended with him on the floor of a supply room, disarmed and restrained, before he had even finished explaining what he wanted from her. Marin did not look at him again. She walked back down the hallway to check on Daniel Reyes, who had slept through the entire thing, and resumed charting his vitals exactly 15 minutes later than her last entry, as if nothing at all had happened in between, though her hands, when she finally let herself notice them, were still entirely steady. They had not shaken once, not in the supply room, not in the hallway afterward, not now. That, more than anything else, told her how much of the old self she had buried, but never actually managed to lose. It was Linda Park who finally asked the question everyone in that hallway was thinking, and nobody had quite found the nerve to say out loud. "Who taught you to do that?" Marin did not answer right away. She finished writing a number on the chart, set down her pen, and looked up with the same calm, unreadable expression she wore through every code, every crisis, every quiet night shift that had ever asked more of her than it appeared to from the outside. "It's a long story," she said. "Let's just say, I used to do a different kind of work." Nobody on that floor knew yet exactly what that meant. They were about to find out, though not as soon as they might have liked, because Marin had spent 3 years learning how to answer questions about her past without actually answering them, and old habits, as she had already discovered twice that week, did not disappear simply because a person wanted them to. Detective Paul Ingram arrived a little before 5, summoned from home for the 2nd time in a week by a call from Eastbridge Regional, and found the 4th floor wearing the particular controlled chaos of a scene that had already been mostly cleaned up before anyone official got a chance to see it properly messy. He listened to 3 different accounts of the same 90 seconds before he made his way to Marin, found her at the nurse's station finishing paperwork, as though the night had contained nothing more dramatic than a routine admission, and sat down across from her with the patient, careful eyes of a man who had taken a great many statements in his career, and could usually tell within the first sentence whether the person in front of him was telling the truth. "Walk me through it," he said. She did, calmly and in order, leaving out only the parts that did not concern the investigation, the flicker of memory that had surfaced and vanished in the middle of the confrontation, the particular stillness she had felt settle into her chest, the moment she understood the man's hand was no longer empty. Ingram listened without interrupting, jotting occasional notes, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "You moved like you'd done this before," he said. "I used to be in the Navy," Marin said simply. "Doing what exactly?" She held his gaze and said nothing, which told him more than an answer would have. Ingram nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he decides not to push on a door that is clearly going to stay shut a while longer, and closed his notebook. "Whatever it was," he said, "Daniel Reyes is alive this morning because of it. So is the case against whoever's running this, probably. I'd say that's worth more than whatever's sitting in your old file." Marin did not respond to that either. She was thinking, instead, about the man's face in the moment before he understood what was happening to him, the genuine surprise in it, the way a person's entire understanding of a room could collapse in under 2 seconds, when he had built his whole approach on assuming the smallest person in it was also the weakest. She had seen that look before, a long time ago, on faces far away from any hospital, faces she did not let herself think about often, faces that belonged to a version of her life she had worked very hard to leave behind a quiet apartment door 3 years earlier. She finished her shift at 7 that morning, walked out to her car the same way she always did, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. The sky over the parking lot was turning the pale gray of early morning, the same color it had been her first night on Daniel Reyes's case, and she found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that danger so often arrived wearing the most ordinary hours of the day. Somewhere across the city, in an office with the blinds drawn against the morning light, a man named Victor Lang was receiving a phone call he did not want to take. He listened to the report without speaking, his jaw tightening with each new detail, his fingers tapping a slow, irritated rhythm against the surface of his desk. The man he had sent to finish a simple piece of unfinished business was now sitting in police custody, taken down not by federal agents or hired security, but by a single hospital nurse working a night shift, alone, with nothing in her hands but a roll of gauze and a supply cart. When the call ended, Lang sat very still for a long time, turning over a single piece of information that troubled him far more than anything else in the report. A nurse had done this, not trained security, not the federal agents he had already accounted for and planned around carefully. A nurse, alone in under 2 minutes, against a man he had used for exactly this kind of work for the better part of 4 years, without a single failure on his record. He did not yet know her name. He intended to find out, and he intended to learn a great deal more about her than the hospital's own administration had ever bothered to ask when they hired her 3 years earlier. He picked up his phone again, scrolled to a contact he rarely used unless the situation genuinely called for it, a man who specialized in finding exactly the kind of information that careful people preferred to keep buried, and typed a short, simple message. "I need everything you can find on a nurse named Marin Cole. Start with her military record. I have a feeling there's more to it than anyone's bothered to look at." He set the phone down, poured himself a drink he did not particularly want, and stared out at the gray morning light filling the gaps between the closed blinds, already rearranging his plans around a problem he had not anticipated needing to solve. The trial was 6 days away. Daniel Reyes was still breathing, still scheduled to testify, still sitting at the center of a case Lang could not afford to lose, and now, standing between him and that outcome, was a hospital nurse who had apparently spent some portion of her life learning exactly the kind of skills his own people were paid to have. He did not like surprises. He liked them even less when they came wearing scrubs. By mid-morning, word of what had happened on the 4th floor had already begun moving through Eastbridge Regional, the way word always moved through a building full of people who worked long hours together and ran out of better things to talk about by the end of a shift. Nurses who had never exchanged more than a passing hello with Marin found themselves repeating versions of the story to one another in the cafeteria, each retelling a little more dramatic than the last, until the quiet woman who barely spoke above a murmur during a code had become, in the space of a single morning, something close to a legend on a floor that had known her for 3 years without ever once suspecting what she was capable of. Marin heard none of it directly. She had gone home, finally slept a few uneasy hours, and woken in the early afternoon to 3 missed calls from Grace and a single text message from Detective Ingram asking her to come in for a follow-up statement before her next shift began. She read both, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and sat for a long moment in the quiet of her apartment, aware, in a way she had not quite let herself be aware of yet, that the careful, ordinary life she had built over the last 3 years had just become considerably less ordinary, and that there was very little she could do now to put it back the way it had been. She thought about Daniel Reyes. 6 days from a courtroom he might not have reached without her. She thought about the man on the floor of the supply room, about the contact he had clearly been working for, about how an organization patient enough to forge hospital credentials and steal a vehicle for surveillance was unlikely to simply accept the loss of one operative and walk away. She drove back to Eastbridge that afternoon for her follow-up statement, arriving an hour before her shift technically began, and found Grace waiting for her near the staff entrance, arms crossed against the cold, relief written plainly across her face the moment she spotted her. "You could have called me back," Grace said. "I needed to sleep first," Marin said. "Some of it anyway." Grace studied her for a long moment, the kind of look old friends give each other when they are trying to decide how much has actually changed and how much simply looks different in new light. "Is it over?" she asked. "Whatever this is it actually over now?" Marin considered the question carefully before answering, because she owed Grace something closer to the truth than she had been giving most people that week. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it is. I think it's just getting started, and I think the people behind it are going to be a lot more careful next time." Grace did not look surprised by that, only tired, the particular tiredness of a person who had spent the last week watching a friend carry something heavy without being allowed to help carry it. "Then what happens now?" "Now I finish my statement," Marin said, "and then I think I need to make a phone call I've been putting off for 3 years." Inside, Detective Ingram took her revised statement with brisk efficiency, asking sharper questions than he had the night before, clearly working a theory he had not yet shared with her about how deep the operation behind the supply room incident actually ran. He confirmed, almost as an aside, that the man in custody had said exactly nothing since his arrest, beyond requesting a lawyer, a silence that told Ingram more about the size of the organization behind him than any confession could have. "Men like that don't stay quiet for free," he said. "Somebody's making it worth his while to keep his mouth shut. Or somebody's made it very clear what happens if he doesn't." Marin absorbed that the way she absorbed everything now, quietly, without visible reaction, though privately she understood exactly what it meant, and exactly how much it changed the shape of the 6 days remaining before Daniel Reyes was scheduled to testify. She left the hospital a little after 4, sat in her car in the parking lot for a long while with her phone resting on her knee, and finally, before she could talk herself out of it again, scrolled to a name she had not dialed in 3 years and pressed call. "Hale," a voice answered on the second ring, graveled and unmistakable, exactly as she remembered it. "It's Cole," Marin said. "I need a favor, and I need you not to ask too many questions about why." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the quiet life his former operative had supposedly built for herself. "Tell me what you need," Hale said. That version of herself, she was beginning to understand, was not finished yet. Not while Daniel Reyes still needed her. Not while a man named Victor Lang was somewhere across the city, learning her name for the first time, and deciding exactly how much of his resources he was willing to spend finding out what else she could do. 2 days after the call to her old commander, a man Marin had not seen in 3 years walked through the doors of Eastbridge Regional, carrying a duffel bag and an expression that made the front desk staff instinctively straighten in their chairs. He gave his name as a visitor, signed in under a designation that meant nothing to anyone who checked it, and found Marin on her break in the staff lounge exactly where she had told him she would be. "You look the same," Hale said, settling into the chair across from her, his graveled voice quieter in person than it had been over the phone. "Tired, but the same." "You look older," Marin said. "Comes with the job." He set the duffel bag down beside his chair, did not open it, and studied her for a long moment, with the particular careful attention of a man who had spent years learning to read the people under his command, better than they read themselves. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out because you think it sounds small. Small details are usually the ones that matter." She told him everything. The gunshot patient who turned out to be a federal witness. The SUV outside the hospital her first morning on the case. The forged badge and the restricted door. The supply room and the man who had laughed at her before learning exactly why he should not have. Hale listened without interrupting, the same way he always had, occasionally jotting a note in a small notebook he produced from his jacket pocket, his expression giving away nothing until she finished. "Victor Lang," he said finally. "I know the name. Not personally, but it's crossed a few desks I used to sit near. He's careful, patient, and he doesn't usually send the same kind of trouble twice. If he's lost one operative already, he's not going to send another amateur to finish the job." "What does he send instead?" Marin asked. "Someone who actually knows what he's doing," Hale said. "And probably more than one of them. He's got 6 days before this witness testifies, and an entire operation riding on that testimony never happening. A man like that doesn't fold quietly. He escalates." Marin felt the truth of that settle into her chest, the way truth always settled, without comfort, without room for argument. "Then we need to be ready for whatever comes next." "That's why I'm here," Hale said, finally unzipping the duffel bag enough to show her a glimpse of its contents. Equipment she recognized instantly from a life she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. Equipment that had no business sitting in the staff lounge of a hospital. "I made some calls on the way over. I have a feeling our friend Lang isn't planning to make his move inside this building again. Too much attention on it now, which means his next opportunity is going to come somewhere your federal friends control a lot less of the environment." "The transport," Marin said. "Moving Reyes to the courthouse." "That's my read," Hale said, "and I'd put money on it happening the day of the hearing, not before. He'll want it to look like an accident, or a robbery gone wrong, something that doesn't point straight back to him in front of a judge." Over the next 4 days, Marin split her time between her usual shifts at Eastbridge and quiet conversations with Hale, Detective Ingram, and eventually Iris Doyle, and the federal agents assigned to Reyes's protective detail. Conversations that grew steadily more serious as the testimony date approached. She did not tell them everything about her own background, only what was necessary, only enough to be taken seriously by people who had initially been inclined to treat her insights as the well-meaning concern of a civilian who had gotten lucky once in a supply closet. That changed once Hale vouched for her credentials in the careful, vague language people in his line of work used when they meant a great deal more than they said directly. By the 3rd day, the lead agent on Reyes's detail, a serious woman named Dana Whitlock, had stopped treating Marin as an outsider and started treating her as exactly what she was, a former operative with relevant experience and a personal stake in making sure nothing went wrong on the day that mattered most. Detective Ingram stopped by the staging location on the 2nd day, drawn less by official business than by simple curiosity about how far this particular case had traveled beyond the boundaries of a normal hospital incident. He found Marin bent over a printed map of the city with Hale and Agent Whitlock, the 3 of them tracing possible routes with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for people who had done this exact sort of planning many times before. "I figured you'd still be charting vitals somewhere," Ingram said, leaning against the doorway. "I am, between this," Marin said. "The hospital still needs nurses, even when one of them used to do something else for a living." Ingram studied the map for a moment, then studied her, something settling into place behind his eyes, the particular understanding of a man who had spent a career learning to recognize competence when it stood in front of him, regardless of what uniform it happened to be wearing that week. "Whatever you used to do," he said, "I'm glad it's you standing between Reyes and whatever's coming next, instead of someone with less of a reason to care how this turns out." "It's not really about the case for me anymore," Marin admitted. "He asked me if I'd still be there. I told him I would." Ingram nodded slowly, as if that answer made more sense to him than anything in either of their files ever could, and left without further comment, though he made a point, before he went, of leaving his direct line with Agent Whitlock, in case anything broke loose that needed a faster city response than the federal channels could provide on their own. Across the city, in the office with the perpetually drawn blinds, Victor Lang received the report he had been waiting for, a thin file containing everything his contact had managed to dig up on a nurse named Marin Cole. He read it twice, slowly, his expression unreadable, lingering longest on the section detailing 6 years of Navy service, a sniper qualification, and 2 deployments redacted so heavily that the file practically apologized for how little it could tell him. He set the file down and sat in silence for a long time, recalculating an operation that had seemed, only a week earlier, almost finished. A witness who was supposed to be dead, a hired operative who was supposed to handle one simple piece of unfinished business, and was instead sitting in a holding cell saying nothing. And now, standing between him and the only outcome that mattered, a woman whose actual background suggested she was considerably more dangerous than anyone on his payroll had accounted for. He did not panic. Men like Victor Lang did not survive as long as he had by panicking. He simply adjusted, the way he always adjusted, pulling together a team he trusted more than the one operative he had already lost, studying the route the federal marshals would most likely use to move Reyes to the courthouse, and settling on a plan considerably more aggressive than anything he had attempted inside the hospital. He would not get another chance after this one. He intended to make it count. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and overcast, the kind of weather that made the city feel smaller than it actually was. Every street pressed flat under low clouds. Maren had not slept more than a few hours, though she did not feel it, the old readiness carrying her the way it always had, on mornings that mattered more than sleep did. She met Hale and Agent Whitlock at a staging location 2 blocks from the hospital an hour before the scheduled transport, and the 3 of them walked through the route one final time, identifying the same choke points and exposure windows that Hale had flagged days earlier. "If he's going to move," Hale said, "it'll be here." He tapped a section of the route where the transport vehicle would be forced to slow through a narrow underpass, a location with limited sight lines and almost no room to maneuver if something went wrong. Tight, predictable, and easy to control if you've got people positioned in advance. "It's exactly where I'd choose." Agent Whitlock did not love the idea of a civilian, even a former operative, taking an active role in a federal protective operation. But 4 days of careful argument from Hale, and a growing respect for Maren's instincts, had worn down most of her objections. In the end, she agreed to a modified route, additional unmarked support vehicles, and a single quiet adjustment that nobody outside their small circle would know about until it mattered. Maren positioned not inside the transport convoy, but above it, on the rooftop of a parking structure overlooking the underpass Hale had identified, watching the route the way she used to watch routes that carried far more weight than this one. The transport left Eastbridge Regional at 9 in the morning, Daniel Reyes seated between 2 federal marshals in an armored vehicle that looked, to anyone watching from the street, like nothing more than an unremarkable government car. Maren settled into position 20 minutes earlier, the city spread out below her in the flat gray light, her breathing slow and even, every part of her mind narrowing down to the single corridor of street where Hale believed the danger would arrive, if it arrived at all. It arrived 12 minutes after the convoy left the hospital. 2 vehicles pulled into position at either end of the underpass, just as the transport entered it, blocking the only easy paths forward and back, exactly the kind of coordinated, professional move Hale had warned them to expect. Maren saw it unfold from above with the particular clarity she had not felt in 3 years. Every piece of the operation visible at once, the timing, the positioning, the careful choreography of men who had clearly done this kind of work before. She did not hesitate. She had already decided, long before that morning arrived, exactly what she would do if the moment came, and the moment had come. Her voice over the radio was as steady as it had been in the supply room, in the hallway, in every quiet conversation she had ever had with a frightened patient, learning to trust her completely, without quite understanding why. "Contact both ends of the underpass," she said. "They're boxing the convoy in. You need to move now, not in 30 seconds. What followed lasted under 4 minutes, though every person involved in it would later describe the experience of those 4 minutes as feeling considerably longer. Maren's warning over the radio gave Agent Whitlock and her team the few critical seconds they needed to react rather than simply respond. The difference, in situations like this, between control and chaos. The transport vehicle's reinforced design held against an attempt to force it open. Federal agents who had been quietly repositioned along the route closed in faster than anyone blocking the underpass had accounted for, and from her position above it all, Maren did exactly what years of training had once made her very good at doing, providing the kind of overwatch that turned a near-certain ambush into a contained, controllable situation instead. By the time city police arrived in force, the men who had blocked the underpass were in custody. The transport vehicle was moving again, undamaged, and Daniel Reyes was on his way to a courthouse he would, in fact, reach safely, exactly as Marin had promised him he would. Victor Lang learned what had happened less than an hour later, the report delivered in the same flat, careful voice his people always used when bringing him news he did not want to hear. He listened without speaking, set down the phone, and understood, in the particular way men like him eventually had to understand things, that the operation was over. Federal agents arrived at his office before the end of that same day, armed with evidence that had been building against him for months, and an urgent reason to act, now that his attempt to silence a witness had failed twice. He was taken into custody quietly, without the kind of drama his own operations had always relied on, and the case that followed would, in time, dismantle a trafficking operation that had moved through 3 states for the better part of a decade. Daniel Reyes testified 4 days later, calm and steady on the stand, his account detailed and unwavering, in a way that left little room for doubt. The courtroom never learned the full story of how close that testimony had come to never happening. Not the supply room, not the underpass, not the woman who had spent the better part of 2 weeks making certain a frightened man lived long enough to tell the truth in front of a judge. Some stories, Marin had learned long ago, were better left mostly untold. Eastbridge Regional's administration, badly shaken by everything that had unfolded on their 4th floor, pulled Marin's personnel file for review once the dust finally settled, the same file that had sailed through hiring 3 years earlier, without a second glance. This time someone actually read it from beginning to end, and what they found explained, finally, everything the staff had spent 2 weeks whispering about in the cafeteria: 6 years of Navy service. A sniper qualification listed plainly enough, though the deployments beneath it remained marked with redactions that meant whatever Marin Cole had actually done during those years stayed, officially, none of anyone's business. Linda Park read the file twice, closed it, and decided, quietly, not to ask any further questions, because some files were clearly meant to stay closed, and the woman who carried that history had just helped save a federal case, and very possibly several lives along with it. Word of the full story, or as much of it as the hospital staff ever pieced together, moved through Eastbridge the way word always moved through a building full of people who worked long hours together. Grace found her in the break room a week later, sat down across from her without preamble, and studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You could have told me," Grace said, "any of it." "It wasn't relevant," Marin said. "Most days, it still isn't." Grace let out a short laugh, more disbelief than humor. It was extremely relevant the last 2 weeks. On those days, yes. Marin allowed herself a small, tired smile, the closest thing to agreement she was willing to offer. Most other days, it's just a job I used to have. She meant it when she said it, though she understood now, in a way she had not fully understood before Daniel Reyes was wheeled through those emergency doors, that the quiet life she had built for herself would never again be entirely separate from the life she had lived before it. Some parts of a person did not stay buried simply because they were inconvenient to remember. They waited, patient and unhurried, for exactly the moment they were needed, and then they stepped forward without asking permission. Marin returned to her normal rotation the following week, checking vitals, adjusting medications, working her shifts with the same even temperament she had always carried. Her co-workers treated her, mostly, the same way they always had, though she noticed, now, the way certain people glanced at her a half-second longer than they used to, the way a few of them seemed to stand a little straighter when she walked past, as though some unspoken understanding had quietly settled into place between them. She did not mind it. She had spent 3 years trying to disappear into an ordinary life, and some part of her, she was beginning to admit, was relieved not to have to disappear quite so completely anymore. On a quiet Tuesday night 2 weeks later, the doors of the emergency bay burst open, a gurney coming through fast, wheels screaming against tile, paramedics shouting numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside that room. Marin Cole was already moving, before the doors finished swinging shut behind it, calm, steady, exactly where she had always belonged, in the middle of whatever came next.